Hi, I'm Tim Prossel. There are a couple of things I want to explain before you watch this video. First of all, for several years I've been interested in the history of ghosts, and specifically the history of ghost hunters. For instance, the phrase ghost hunter is one that I've traced back to the year 1804. A couple of weeks ago, I was sort of rummaging through old ghost hunting chronicles, and I came across one written by a man named William F. Barrett. He was an English physicist with an interest in the paranormal, what he calls the supernormal. It was published in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research in 1915, and as I was reading this, I noticed that it was made up of 5 very distinct voices. And it occurred to me that this just might work nicely as a dramatic reading. Here's the other thing. Jump to 2020. We've got a pandemic. We're all in quarantine. And I've got a number of actor friends who are itching to get back on stage or do something. So here is this chronicle that would work well as a dramatic reading. I've got friends willing to do that. I approached them. Surprisingly, they said yes. So I gave them the script. I said, record this at home. If you want to wear a little costume, go ahead, but keep it pretty informal. I'll splice it all together and I'll put it up on the internet. So that's what you're about to see. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go put on my William F. Barrett costume. Investigation of a Haunted House in Worcestershire by Sir W. F. Barrett, FRS. Last July I received a letter from Mrs. Roberts, pseudonym, giving me details of mysterious disturbances that had occurred for some time past in their house in Worcestershire. The house occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Roberts is quite in the country, about 2 miles from a railway station. It stands back from the road and has a large and beautiful garden around and behind it. The house is a very old one, of 2 stories with thick walls, and considerable alterations and additions had been made by Mr. Roberts. Mrs. Roberts' first letter is as follows.
The facts are these. We came to this house nearly 3 years ago, and although it had the reputation of being haunted, we thought it was due to the fact that there is a novel about a haunted house of the same name, and having no reference whatever to this house, and we thought nothing of it. A few months ago, however, odd things began to happen. One evening, one of the maids went to do my room after I had gone down to dinner, and was startled by hearing groans coming from under my bed. She thought it was the dog, and was walking towards the bed when she saw a figure emerge, and distinctly heard its footsteps go round the room, out of the door, and along the passage. She was much too frightened to pursue it. The only people in the house at the time were my husband and myself in the dining room, my small children asleep in bed, and the old cook in the kitchen, who I think would have been incapable of the agility that would have been necessary if it had been any human being playing a trick. A few weeks later, a temporary maid, who heard nothing of this incident while she was here, swore to hearing footsteps come into her room, walk to the dressing table, then come to the bed, and she thought her bed was pushed against the one of the maids sleeping next to her. A light revealed nothing. The next night she again heard footsteps walking up and down outside her room. About 6 weeks later, my nurse awoke one night by a tremendous noise in the room below her, which is the day nursery. There were sounds as if the window was being pushed up and down, and the furniture of the room being thrown about. She thought someone must have gotten into the house, and she was coming to call my husband when the noises stopped. The next night, she heard loud groaning in the room overhead, the cook's room, and thought she must be feeling ill. But next day the cook said she had slept all through the night and heard nothing herself, though she constantly complains of noises, footsteps, and occasionally says she feels her bedclothes being pulled. Just lately things have gotten worse. My nurse, who is perfectly cool-headed and was most skeptical about the other incidents, woke suddenly one night, then heard footsteps come into the room and walk in a great hurry between her bed and my elder little boy's, felt something brush past her head, and then heard the footsteps hurry to the dressing table, then back, and cease at the door. During this time, and while the noise was still in the room, she managed to strike a light, but there was nothing to be seen. She was very much afraid, and described a feeling of there being something there which one could not get by. A few nights later, the same thing occurred, but that time she had the feeling of a hand being put on her throat and of receiving a push. Well, that night she had a nightlight burning but saw nothing. She also describes a noise outside her door a few nights ago, when nothing else happened, a noise like an iron bedstead being kicked. Since then she has heard groaning in her room. Oh, and on the same night the cook heard noises. Oh, and the maid, who saw the first apparition, and since then has experienced nothing, was woke by the feeling of someone pushing her on the shoulder. She thought it was the maid who shares her room trying to wake her, but found that the maid was asleep and there was no one else there. My husband has since had much the same experience, accompanied by a feeling of great stupor. He attributes it to indigestion. If things go on at this rate, all our servants will be leaving, and it is altogether very unpleasant. Can you, with your very large experience, suggest any explanation or cure? I much hope you will forgive me for troubling you with this long letter. Even now, there are details which I have left out.
Writing to me again a week later, Mrs. Roberts says,
I very much wish you could come over and investigate these mysterious phenomena, but I hardly like to press you to come so far on the small chance of anything occurring when you are here. The phenomena appear to center round our cook. She's certainly not young, but although one or two mysterious noises had been heard before she came, nothing really developed till she had been here some weeks. She admits to having lived in places where similar things have happened, and my hope is that when she leaves in a month's time, the poltergeist will leave with her. I have just been told by my nurse that she heard noises again last night, a loud yell being followed by bumping noises, which went on over a period of 1.5 hours. Unfortunately, she was too much alarmed to come and call my husband and me. If you think of coming, I think a weekend would be the best, as Sunday is rather a favorite night. There are 1 or 2 elements in our case which do not seem quite to fit in with orthodox poltergeist behavior, but as they are more difficult to vouch for than the noises, I have not felt able to lay stress on them. But if you come, we can discuss all this. I must, however, warn you once more of the extremely erratic behavior of the phenomena, sometimes disappearing for weeks. Lately, however, not more than a week has passed without something happening.
I arranged accordingly to go over and spend a weekend with Mr. and Mrs. Roberts, to whom I am greatly indebted for their kind hospitality, and also giving me every assistance in the investigations I made. During the time I was there, I took down the testimony of the different inmates of the house who had personally experienced these abnormal disturbances. The evidence in each case was given to me independently and alone, and my cross-examination of the witnesses was cheerfully submitted to, and did not shake the evidence. Dorothy L., under-nurse and housemaid, said,
I was in Mrs. Roberts' bedroom one Sunday evening last March about 8 p.m. when I heard a groaning coming from under the bed. It sounded very like a dog moaning, and it occurred twice over. There was a bedroom lamp lit in the room, but I saw nothing to account for the sound. Suddenly, as I was standing by the dressing table, I felt a hand placed on my chest, and I was pushed over by the pressure back into the dressing table. A moment later, I saw a figure as if coming from under the bed, moving across the room towards the door. I only saw the back of the figure, which was tall and white-clothed. The figure went through the door, out of the room, and I distinctly heard its footsteps on the landing outside. I was so petrified that I was unable to stir for a minute or two, and I was afraid of screaming, as it would have frightened the children who were in the bed in the adjoining room. As soon as I recovered, I rushed downstairs and I told the cook what had happened. And later on, I told the head nurse, who informed Mrs. Roberts.
At the time Dorothy saw the figure, Mr. and Mrs. Roberts were at dinner in the dining room, which was downstairs but not under this bedroom. The cook was at the moment engaged in dishing up the dinner. The head nurse and parlour maid had gone to church, and that Sunday evening there was no one else staying in the house. I inquired if there was a dog on the premises, and found a dog was kept in the yard outside, but not allowed in the house. On this occasion the dog was not in the premises at all, for the head nurse, as was her custom, had taken the dog to accompany her to church, where it waited outside till the service was over and accompanied the nurse home. No other dog was kept, and no stray dog was in the place. On another occasion, about 3 weeks previous to my visit, Dorothy said,
I was in bed and it was just getting daylight when I woke up with the sound of someone coming into the bedroom. Something crossed the room and it came to my bedside and pushed me. I did not see any figure. There was hardly any light enough, but I distinctly felt a push on my shoulder, and then it went away. I lay awake till it was time to get up, but nothing more occurred. I am sure it was not a dream. The parlour maid was asleep in her bed adjoining mine all the time. This is the last time that the ghost visited me.
I next examined the cook, an elderly person named Mrs. E., who said,
Dorothy on the Sunday came downstairs and told me of the fright she had in the apparition she saw in Mrs. Roberts' bedroom, but I could not believe her. However, a little while afterwards I heard a groaning in my bedroom and the noise of someone going out of the room, but I saw nothing. I was in bed when the groaning woke me up. The room was quite dark and I was too frightened to stir or light the candle. Another night I heard a stamping sound as if someone was walking heavily across the room. This time I did get up and light the candle and went outside on the landing. The time was 2 a.m. On at least half a dozen other occasions I heard similar sounds after midnight, but saw nothing. For the last week or two I've heard nothing. But when I lived with a family in the Isle of Wight, I also heard on several occasions curious noises which could not be explained. The sounds were like someone smashing crockery or moving furniture, and sometimes footsteps. These sounds were also heard by my mistress and others, and they were much frightened and said it was dreadful. The family with whom I lived in the Isle of Wight have, I believe, now gone to New Zealand.
The cook left the Isle of Wight to come to Mrs. Roberts. Her bedroom is upstairs over the night nursery, and she sleeps alone. She told me she was perfectly sure no one was playing a trick on her, and said she was certain some object was standing by her bedside and uttering these groans, which woke her up on the first occasion. I next examined Ethel C., the nurse, a most intelligent and respectable person, about 30 years old. Ethel C. said,
Dorothy told me of the fright she had and the figure she'd seen on the Sunday evening on my return from church that night. The date was March 22nd, as I put it down in my diary immediately afterwards. At first I could not believe it, although Dorothy declared it was perfectly true. The dog had gone with me to church that evening, as it always does, for the church is 3.5 miles walk through country roads, and the dog goes as my companion and waits outside the church till I come out, and it did so on this occasion. Some time after this, when I was in bed in my room, the night nursery, which is over the day nursery, I heard the window of the room below suddenly thrown open and then shut down again, and the furniture knocked about in the room below. I got up and I lit my candle, and I found it was 1:30 a.m. I was too frightened to go downstairs by myself, and I was going to call Mr. Roberts when the sound ceased, after going on for nearly 15 minutes. I then laid down again and waited, but nothing more occurred that night. The only other persons in my bedroom were the 2 children who were fast asleep. When I got up in the morning early, I went to the room below and examined the room. Nothing was disturbed. The windows were fastened and the door locked as usual. On a subsequent occasion, June 15th last, the children being asleep in their cots, and I myself had been asleep when I was awoke by hearing heavy footsteps, as if made by a person with hobnail boots, coming into the room. The footsteps tramped across the room towards the dressing table. I was terrified, but managed to light the candle by my bedside and found it was 1:20 a.m. The perspiration was running off my forehead with fear, and I kept the candle alight, but no more sleep was possible that night. I was really too frightened to get out of bed to call Mr. Roberts, and nothing further occurred that night. I am sure the sound of the tramping did not come from someone walking in the garden outside, for I felt the bed shaking with the heavy tread. A week later, when in bed in the same room, I heard groans coming from someone standing near my bed, and then felt an object brush by my head. I lit the candle, found it was 1:30 a.m. The children were fast asleep in their beds, and there was nothing to explain the sounds. The same night I heard a noise outside my room, as if someone was striking a metallic rod. I laid awake, but nothing else occurred. A few days later, a horrible experience happened to me. I had been in bed some time, but was not asleep, when a hand suddenly gripped my throat, and another hand gripped the side of my body. The grip on my throat was so violent that it hurt, but did not choke me. I managed to light the candle after a few minutes, and found it was 1:30 a.m. The children were fast asleep, and no one else was in the room. I am sure it was not a nightmare. After that, I always kept a light burning in my room all night, and nothing like that experience happened again, although I have heard unaccountable noises several times.
Mr. Roberts had fitted up an electric bell communicating with his room from the nurse's bedside, and the Sunday night before I arrived, July 12th, the nurse rang the bell. Mr. Roberts threw on a dressing gown and ran to the room at once. The nurse had heard heavy footsteps moving about the landing outside the door. Mr. Roberts searched the whole house but found nothing to account for them. He then sat outside the room for some time, but nothing else occurred that night. On one occasion, the nurse told me she was going downstairs in the evening when some object was felt near her, as if trying to stop her passing. She went back to her bedroom, lit a candle, but could find nothing to account for it. She assured me that the noises could not be explained by any hoax or natural cause, nor was her experience the result of anything Dorothy had said, for she had dismissed that narration as absurd. She is not of a nervous disposition, as is shown by her having had sole charge of the house and slept alone in it for 3 weeks before the disturbances began. Mrs. Roberts has neither heard nor seen anything supernormal. Mr. Roberts, on one occasion, I was informed, distinctly felt a presence, as of some person brushing past him, but could find nothing to account for it. I examined every room in the house. The night nursery was carpeted with thick felt, and hardly any sound was made when I walked across it. The nurse imitated the sound she heard by stamping across the room from the door past her bed to the dressing table, and I noticed that the room shook as she trod heavily. The house is old, and the floors upstairs shake when they are tramped across. The room I slept in was opposite the night nursery on the first floor, the doors facing each other across the wide landing. An electric bell was temporarily fitted up by my bedside, and the bell push by the nurse's bed in the room opposite. The doors were also left open during the night, and I remained awake till 2:30 a.m. Nothing, however, occurred during the whole time of my stay. After I had left, I received the following letter from Mrs. Roberts.
The night you left, July 20th, Ethel in the nursery and the two maids who slept together upstairs heard awful groaning lasting 15 to 20 minutes, which seemed to go round the house. They all confirmed that. Last Sunday night, August 2nd, I was sitting at dinner late, about 9:15, as I had not been able to leave my husband, who was ill, sooner. Ethel rushed into the dining room to say that she had heard extraordinary noises appearing to come from the cellar when she was in the larder. I went to the larder where Ethel and Lester, my ci-devant children's nurse, who is staying here now, were engaged in breaking up ice for my husband. All was then quiet, and I went back to my dinner. Shortly after, Ethel came in again to say that they had heard 4 loud noises like furniture being pushed about, and I went out again. This is the lie of the land there. I asked Lester if she would go down with me to inspect the cellar. She said yes, and seized a lamp, and we were just starting, leaving the door into hall and larder open, when I heard my husband coughing, and I rushed upstairs. When I re-emerged about half an hour later, I found that Lester had stayed where I left her, on the little landing at the top of the cellar stairs, and shortly afterwards heard footsteps coming up them. She shouted, "What do you want?" and the footsteps stopped. But the cook, who was close by, also heard them, fainted from fright at this moment. I then went and asked Lester and Ethel to come and inspect the cellar with me. We did this thoroughly, and nothing human was to be seen. Last night, August 5th, Florence, the parlour-maid, woke suddenly about 3 a.m. to become aware of a dark form standing over her bed, between herself and the window, which is near her bed on the left-hand side. She described it as showing against the window darker than night, and she could see the outline of protruding ears. She said her matches were by the bed, but she dared not put out her hand for them, as she felt she would have put it through the figure. She shut her eyes and did not open them for a long time. When she did, all was as usual. She heard nothing. I have taken time to write all this in order, that you may be au courant, and that the dates may be put down.
One other letter I had from Mrs. Roberts as follows.
Since Mrs. E. the cook left on the 12th, we have had peace, perfect peace, as far as ghosts are concerned. Things were very acute the last few days, and the two maids, Florence and Dorothy, heard noises in Mrs. E.'s room one morning about 6:30, and thought at first it was Mrs. E. herself walking about, and opening and shutting her tin box. It turned out, however, when Dorothy went across to investigate, that the old lady had gone downstairs. Later in the day, noises were heard in the larder when no one was there, and footsteps on the stairs leading to the attics. Mrs. E. said she saw a bright light flash through the larder, and again she nearly fainted. The very day of her departure, the servants felt an entire change of atmosphere in the house, and one by one commented on it. Not a sound has been heard since. It seems to me the queerest thing. Ethel has just told me that for months she has been dreaming that we were leaving this house, the dreams beginning before my nurse left in February, or the ghost trouble began.
In conclusion, I may add that the landlord of the house has been written to several times to inquire if previous tenants had complained of any disturbances, but he had never given any reply to this question until just before I left, when in answer to the question whether the previous tenant had seen or heard any ghost, he replied nothing, so far as he knew, had been heard or seen by previous tenants. Mr. and Mrs. Roberts gave up the house in the autumn and are now living elsewhere.